the greatest impact as an athlete. We're going to talk about Michael Jordan. Today, we're going to be talking about what it is to be like Mike. We're going to talk about Michael Jordan's impact on American sport and society. As an overview, we're going to talk about Michael Jordan's contribution to the growth of the NBA. We're going to talk about his deals with Nike and his commercial deals, which set up the endorsements later on for athletes with their name, image, and likeness. We're going to talk about his impact with his sneaker brand on American fashion and culture today. And we're also going to talk about some of the controversies dealing with his silence on issues of racism and activism during his active basketball career. But let's start with who is Mike? Michael Jordan was born in 1963 in Brooklyn, New York, but he was raised with his family in Wilmington, North Carolina, where he grew up as a competitive child playing basketball in the backyard with his older brother. Growing up in Wilmington, he also was a little bit sheltered from the tumultuous racial and political tensions that were happening in the years that he was born. So we see this kind of contrast of Michael Jordan being born in 1963 when politics and racial tensions were super high in America. You have MLK and Malcolm X being assassinated because of the work they're doing in 1963. You see President Kennedy being shot and assassinated. And you see this civil rights struggle, which athletes like Muhammad Ali were super involved in. And then as Jordan grew up, he grew up kind of on this up end of it. So he grew up at a high school that had already been integrated by the time that he got there, and he didn't have as much of the in-your-face issues with race growing up as maybe athletes in the past had. So when he went to UNC, his focus was mostly on his basketball career. His freshman year, he won the national championship game on a game-winning shot. And although in his sophomore and junior year, UNC did not win the national championship, he was National Player of the Year. In 1994, in 1984, he entered the NBA, where he played on and off from 1984 until 2003. And within this time of his first entrance into the NBA in 1984, he brokered one of the most lucrative deals any athlete has made, but especially in his day that any athlete had made up to his time with Nike. So when we're looking at his kind of going back a little bit to the social and historical context that Michael Jordan was in, he was born during a time of intense activism and social and racial conflict within the United States. And then in the 1970s and 80s, you saw athletes that were less willing to speak out about big issues. And so Michael Jordan was kind of lumped in with these athletes whose path had been paved for them, with athletes like Jackie Robinson or Muhammad Ali, who had spoken out vehemently about issues on race and had kind of gotten, they felt the consequences of that. They got titles stricken from them. They weren't able to make as much money because they were willing to speak out. And then Michael Jordan kind of came up in this era where the sociologists kind of coin it as they earned his right to be silent. And so Michael Jordan was able to build his brand and really explore his identity as this higher up in sports, as this influential person, as this iconic and legendary figure in sports. But he didn't have to talk as much about racism. And so he was more focused on building his own individual brand, which he kind of was coined the archetype of the 1990s, which was super commercial, turn of the century. You've got technology that's on the rise, and you have this changing of America's in turmoil too. There's still issues going on in America, but it's less about race. And so in a lot of the readings, I saw Muhammad Ali being compared a lot to Michael Jordan, where you have Muhammad Ali who's willing to speak out and not make money. And you have Michael Jordan who is making a lot of money on his name and his brand and being like Mike and being this super just bigger than earth personality, but he stays a little bit more quiet on issues of race and issues relating to maybe the production of how sneakers are made overseas. So this is the social and historical context. In sport, athletes before him had been a little bit more outspoken, especially athletes of color, Black athletes. And now Michael Jordan is entering the scene and is able to make it a little bit more about him. He's making his own brand, he's making his own image, and he's coming up into this 1980s, 1990s political and historical context. And so the positive impacts that Michael Jordan had, above anything else, he created opportunities for individuals, for athletes specifically, to make huge deals that were never available to them before. But in the same regard, because he had this brand and this identity and in this call to be like Mike, it empowered people in his day, like youths, and especially with his sneakers coming out, for people to build their individual brand. And we see that a lot more nowadays with social media, people building their own brand. But it wasn't as big at that time. And so as Michael Jordan was entering the league and he became this really marketable figure because he was a little bit neutral, he became this almost racially neutral Black man within the NBA scene, where the commissioner and him were able to really market the NBA and market basketball players and get the visibility that they didn't have before. And so, I mean, you also just have the amazing career of Michael Jordan as this greatest basketball athlete of all time, winning 6 national championships with the Bulls and going in and out, winning 3 national championships, taking a break and playing professional baseball, coming back and winning 3 more championships with the Bulls. And he had this just persona about him that really helped the growth of the sport, and NBA is not the same today. And I think even our generation is never going to know basketball before Michael Jordan. And arguably, I'm not sure people care about basketball before Michael Jordan. And we know that basketball is very different today. But the aspect of people and athletes kind of being, the LeBron James, the Kobe Bryant, the Steph Curry, marketable on their own along with their teams was made possible because of Michael Jordan. And then going back to his commercial deals, when Michael Jordan signed his deal with Nike in 1984 for the sale of the Jordan shoes, this was groundbreaking. Specifically, the aspect where he brokered the deal where he was able to get a royalty on every sneaker sold. And so because of that, I mean, the sneakers sold like crazy almost immediately. I think it grossed about 100 million in the first year. And Michael Jordan is still reaping the benefits. He's a part of the designing process. He's a part of the royalties. He gets those deals, and it opens the gate for athletes nowadays with the name, image, and likeness to be able to profit off of who they are, off of their brand, being able to make deals with companies. And we know within the frame of conflict theory and with the frame of the conveyor belt that sometimes this has a negative impact, where it's this hope of you're the one that breaks through, that you're the Michael Jordan, you're the lucky one. And sometimes this causes people to get on the conveyor belt with this false hope. However, we also know that the people who hold the money hold the power. And so, unlike other athletes before Jordan's time, they might have had a voice, but they didn't have money. They didn't have this ability to pass money down to the generations after them. And so, this emergence of making deals and marketing deals with corporations, even though the media or the big corporations are still somewhat in control, Michael Jordan was able to profit off of the people who were going to profit off of him anyways. And so we see this changing the landscape for sports today, for athletes today. And then Jordans in themselves are a phenomenon. I mean, J's on my feet. Are you kidding me? The iconic red, black, and white of a Jordan shoe is just almost speaks for itself. And I think that there's even people now who care more about the sneakers than they do about Michael Jordan's career. And so the way that his sneakers changed the landscape was insane. The league actually was fining him for not having his shoes be 51% white when they were originally dropped, and Nike was willing to cover that fine for every game that he was fined. And this created this kind of edgy subculture within pop culture of sneakers being this way to express yourself and be an individual. And that really just carried and goes along with the Michael Jordan brand and just the influence that he has on culture and basketball still to this day. However, with that comes a lot of criticism because we know that Michael Jordan had so much influence, and yet he stayed quiet on a lot of issues. And so he stayed a little bit quiet on issues like racism, on commercial interests, where his interests aligned more with Nike than they did with the people making the products in sweatshops overseas. And we have to ask ourselves the question of, what does it mean to be like Mike? He has all this influence, but what does it mean? When we look at racism, we know that Jordan stayed particularly neutral on a lot of things, and we do have to confront this, the fact that he kind of set this precedent for Black athletes after him to stay relatively quiet and to just build their own individual brand, and that's had negative impacts, where people could probably speak out and they haven't. Or on commercial interests, we know that above all, Michael was about protecting his brand. And so in this picture, we see the iconic, he's draping the American flag over the Reebok symbol at the 1992 Olympics, because he's more concerned about the fact that he's not going to represent Reebok when he's the face of Nike. And so this begs the question, what does Mike represent other than himself? And I would argue that he actually represents the American dream in itself. We are a society that is about being the best. MJ was the best. We are a society that is about pursuing that American dream, pursuing the happiness, the right to pursue happiness. And I think that as much as we criticize MJ, we're also going to criticize America as a whole. Because if anything, he's the epitome of what it is to chase the American dream, to pursue your own rights and your own interests, and oftentimes at the expense of others. And so even as we're criticizing him, we have to remember and frame it in this way that, like, we are often MJ. We are often all of these people. And although he had this influence, he chose himself, but also at the same time empowered people to choose themselves. And this is an interesting balance. So since his career ended in 2003, Michael Jordan is now an owner of an NBA team. He also has higher stake in Nike, and he's started to also speak up a little bit more on issues. He recently committed to donating $100 million towards racial injustice. And it begs the question, what does it mean to be like Mike now? Is too little too late? Is him being able to speak out about racial injustice kind of a moot point at this point? And I would say that as much as Muhammad Ali was the voice for his generation in social change, I think that that was a very integral piece for athletes nowadays. And then Jordan came in and showed, hey, you can make money, but still had to work the system. He had to stay a little bit more quiet. But now we have athletes who can make money and be vocal, because it's easy to say Michael Jordan could have spoken out and been fine, but we don't know that. We don't know if he had started speaking out, if all of a sudden his success would fall. But I think now, 20 years removed, people are in a very different situation where they can make the millions of dollars in deals and choose the brands and choose the companies that they want to work with. And I think it's still a slow process of change. I think that these things had to build off of one another. So it's not, we have to pin athletes against each other and compare them. It's, I think both were necessary to get to where we're going and to get even where we are now. And so in conclusion, Michael Jordan is kind of like a cloud, you know, he floats on the court. He could make it rain quite literally with the money that he made. And the way that he made it rain also allowed for this growth of a different generation to be able to come up and make money and make a name for themselves. And sometimes clouds come with a little bit of a shadow. You know, we have to deal with the negative impacts that were still pretty big impacts, you know, the precedent of maybe not speaking out and chasing your own independent desires. But with that, even a cloud, the light can break through, and there's redemption and there's hope within this story of Michael Jordan still has this influence that people can look to, they can learn from, and we can be like Mike and have negatives and positives and still come out on top. These are my references, and thank